May 8, 1944. Northern France, the town of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. Colonel James William Harrison stood on a stone bridge, watching smoke rise from the eastern hills. He was 41 years old. He had been in the army for 19 years. He had commanded men in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. He understood warfare. He understood command. He understood that sometimes soldiers die, and commanders must accept that reality and continue the mission. But today, standing on that bridge with German artillery shells landing 2 kilometers away and his radio operator waiting for orders, James Harrison was about to make a decision that would destroy his career, end his marriage, send him to prison, and make his name synonymous with either the greatest act of moral courage or the worst act of military cowardice in American history. The facts were simple. Harrison commanded the 34th Infantry Regiment, approximately 10,000 men. They had been fighting for 72 hours straight since landing on the beaches. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, cut off from the main American advance. German forces had surrounded them on 3 sides. Artillery was ranging closer. Tanks were moving into position. By nightfall, maybe sooner, the Germans would overrun their position. Harrison had 3 options. First, fight. Order his men to hold the line, inflict maximum casualties on the enemy, buy time for other Allied units to advance. This was the militarily correct decision. This was what his training demanded. This was what his orders specified. But this option meant most of his men would die. Maybe all of them. Second, attempt a breakout. Try to punch through German lines, retreat to American positions. This might save some men, maybe half, maybe fewer. It would mean abandoning the wounded. It would mean leaving equipment for the Germans. It would mean giving up strategically important ground. But some would survive. Third, surrender. Raise the white flag. Save his men's lives. Accept capture. Spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. This violated everything Harrison believed about military duty. Officers don't surrender. Regiments don't surrender. You fight until you win or until you die. Surrender was unthinkable, except Harrison was thinking about it because of a child, a French child, a girl, 6 years old. Her name was Marie Dubois. Marie lived in a house at the edge of Saint-Laurent with her grandmother. Her parents were dead, killed in the German invasion of 1940. Her grandmother, 68 years old, had raised her alone for 4 years in occupied France. They had survived. They had hidden. They had endured. And then the Americans arrived, and the fighting came with them. And now Marie and her grandmother were trapped in a house directly between Harrison's position and the advancing German tanks. Harrison's scout had reported this 20 minutes ago. The house was still occupied. 2 civilians, elderly woman and young girl, visible through the windows. The house sat exactly on the route the Germans would take when they attacked. When the tanks came, they would roll right through that house. The building would collapse. Everyone inside would die. Harrison could evacuate them. Send a squad to get them out. Bring them to the American lines. Save their lives. But the moment he sent men to that house, the Germans would see them. The Germans would open fire. The rescue squad would likely die. And more importantly, the rescue attempt would reveal to the Germans exactly where Harrison's defensive positions were. It would give away American strength, American placement, American readiness. It would make the coming German attack more effective. It would kill more of his men. So the calculation was clear. Send men to save the girl and her grandmother, and more of his soldiers die. Don't send men, and the civilians die. But his soldiers have a better chance. The militarily correct decision was obvious. The civilians were not combatants. They were not his responsibility. His responsibility was to his men, to his mission, to winning the war. The civilians were tragic casualties, but war creates tragic casualties. That's the nature of war. Harrison knew this. He had made similar calculations before. In North Africa, he had ordered artillery strikes on buildings that might have contained civilians because enemy soldiers were definitely in those buildings. In Sicily, he had advanced his men through a village knowing civilians were still hiding in basements. In Italy, he had called in airstrikes on bridges that refugees were using to escape. These were correct military decisions. They saved American lives. They advanced the Allied cause. They helped win the war. But Harrison had never seen those civilians. They were abstractions, numbers, possibilities, reports from intelligence officers, estimates from scouts, not real people with faces and names and lives. Marie Dubois was real. Harrison had seen her. 3 days ago, when his regiment first entered Saint Laurent, Harrison had walked past her house. Marie had been in the garden. She was picking flowers. She looked up at Harrison as he walked by. She smiled at him. She waved. Harrison waved back. She said something in French. Harrison didn't speak French. His translator told him she had thanked them for coming to help. That was 3 days ago. Now she was about to die unless Harrison did something. And doing something might kill hundreds of his men, maybe thousands, might lose the battle, might delay the Allied advance, might prolong the war. The radio operator was waiting. The German artillery was getting closer. Harrison's executive officer, Major Thomas Bradley, stood beside him. Bradley knew what Harrison was thinking. He had seen the scout reports. He understood the situation. Bradley was 38 years old, father of 3 children back in Ohio. Good officer. Smart tactician. He understood the math. 1 child versus 10,000 soldiers. The choice was obvious to him, but Harrison was thinking about something else. He was thinking about why they were fighting this war. Why America had sent millions of men across an ocean to fight Germans they had never met in countries most of them couldn't find on a map before 1941. They weren't fighting for territory. They weren't fighting for resources. They were fighting because Nazi Germany represented something evil. They were fighting because the Nazis killed children. They murdered the innocent. They built a system based on deciding some human lives mattered, and other human lives didn't. And now Harrison was being asked to make exactly that calculation. Decide that Marie's life didn't matter, because she wasn't American, because she wasn't a soldier, because saving her was militarily inconvenient, because the math didn't work out. If Harrison abandoned that child, if he let her die when he could save her, what exactly made him different from the enemy he was fighting? This was the question that had been growing in Harrison's mind for 3 days, since he had seen Marie wave at him, since she had thanked him for coming to help, since he had realized that help meant more than just military victory. It meant protecting the innocent. It meant acting like the values America claimed to fight for actually mattered more than tactical advantage. Harrison's radio operator indicated that Colonel Mitchell was on the radio. Mitchell commanded the division. He was 15 kilometers away with the main American force. He had ordered Harrison to hold Saint Laurent at all costs, buy time for the division to regroup and advance. Harrison's regiment was the rear guard. They were supposed to slow the Germans down. They were effectively expendable. Harrison took the radio. Mitchell wanted a status update. Harrison explained the situation. They were surrounded on 3 sides. Germans moving into attack position. Heavy armor. Artillery ranging. They would be overrun within 2 hours. Mitchell asked if they could hold. Harrison told him no. Mitchell then asked how long Harrison could buy the division. This was the question Harrison had been expecting. How long can you let your men die to give us time? How many casualties can you accept? How much can you sacrifice? Harrison requested permission to evacuate civilian non-combatants from the combat zone. There was silence on the radio. Then Mitchell responded that they didn't have resources for civilian evacuation. Harrison's mission was to hold that position. Harrison explained there was a child directly in the path of the German advance. He could save her. Mitchell's voice hardened. Harrison had 10,000 men. His responsibility was to those men and to the division, not to French civilians. Harrison pressed the issue. If he didn't evacuate her, she would die. Mitchell gave him a direct order. Hold the position. Engage the enemy. Buy the division time to advance. Those were his orders. Harrison asked Mitchell to modify those orders. The request was denied. Hold your position. That's an order. The radio went dead. Harrison handed the radio back to his operator. Bradley was watching him. The entire command staff was watching. They all knew what had just happened. They all knew what Harrison was thinking about doing. Harrison walked away from the bridge. He walked alone along the riverbank. He needed to think. He needed to make a decision that he would live with for the rest of his life, or die with. Because if he disobeyed Mitchell's orders, his career was over. His life as he knew it was over. Everything he had worked for would be destroyed. But if he followed orders, Marie would die. And Harrison would know, for the rest of his life, that he had let a child die because military procedure said her life didn't matter as much as tactical advantage. Harrison thought about his own daughter, Sarah. She was 8 years old, 2 years older than Marie. Sarah lived in Virginia with Harrison's wife, Elizabeth. Harrison hadn't seen them in 11 months. He wrote letters every week when he could. He carried Sarah's photograph in his breast pocket. In the photograph, Sarah was wearing a white dress. She was smiling. She was holding a flower. If Sarah were the child in that house, if Sarah were about to be crushed by German tanks, what would Harrison want some other officer to do? Would he want that officer to calculate military advantage? Would he want that officer to decide Sarah's life was less important than tactical position? Or would he want that officer to save her? No matter what it cost, no matter what orders said, no matter what consequences followed. Harrison knew the answer. If Sarah were in that house, he would want someone to save her. He would beg someone to save her. He would demand that someone value her life above strategy and mission and orders. And if that was true for Sarah, then it had to be true for Marie. Because children are children. Lives are lives. The uniform Harrison wore, the flag he fought under, those things were supposed to mean something. They were supposed to mean that American soldiers protected the innocent, that they valued human life, that they represented civilization against barbarism. What good was winning the war if they became the same as the enemy in the process? Harrison walked back to the bridge. His officers were waiting. They saw his face. They knew he had made a decision. Harrison informed them he was going to surrender the regiment. The words hung in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. They all stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. Bradley's face went white. Other officers looked at each other in disbelief. Captain Robert Chen, 29 years old, graduate of West Point, excellent tactical officer, appeared stunned. Chen understood military doctrine. And military doctrine said what Harrison was planning was wrong, was criminal, was unthinkable. Harrison explained his reasoning. He was going to contact the German commander. He was going to negotiate a surrender. He was going to get terms that included safe passage for all civilians in the combat zone. And then he was going to surrender this regiment. He was going to surrender 10,000 men to save one child. Because if they wouldn't do that, then what were they even fighting for? The officers looked at each other. Some were nodding slightly. Others looked horrified. Bradley looked like he was trying to solve an impossible equation. He reminded Harrison that Colonel Mitchell had given a direct order. Harrison acknowledged he was disobeying that order. Bradley pointed out they would court-martial him. Harrison knew they might execute him. Harrison knew that too. Harrison turned to his radio operator and instructed him to contact the German commander, to arrange discussion of surrender terms. The radio operator didn't move. He looked at Bradley. Bradley looked at Harrison. For a moment, it seemed like the officers might refuse, might physically stop Harrison, might relieve him of command and take over themselves. Then Bradley sighed. He indicated quietly that he thought Harrison was making a terrible mistake, but Harrison was his commanding officer. He would follow orders. Harrison thanked him. The radio operator made contact with German forces. It took 20 minutes to establish communication. The German commander was Colonel Franz Richter, 47 years old, career Wehrmacht officer. Richter commanded the forces surrounding Harrison's regiment. The conversation was conducted through translators. Harrison explained his situation. He was prepared to surrender his entire regiment on the condition that all civilians in the combat zone were given safe passage to Allied lines. He specifically mentioned the house with Marie and her grandmother. Those civilians must be evacuated before any German forces entered the area. Richter was silent for a long moment. Then he asked why Harrison was surrendering. American forces had been fighting fiercely for days. They were well positioned. They were inflicting casualties. Why surrender now? Harrison told him the truth. Because there was a child who would die if fighting continued. Because Harrison valued that child's life above military objectives. Because saving her was more important than winning this battle. Richter didn't speak for a full minute. The translator waited. Harrison waited. Then Richter responded. The translator conveyed that Colonel Richter had children. He understood. He accepted Harrison's surrender terms. All civilians would be evacuated safely. Harrison felt something release in his chest. Relief. Terror. The knowledge that he had just destroyed his life, but also the certainty that he had made the only choice he could live with. The surrender was arranged for 2 p.m. That gave Harrison 4 hours to prepare his regiment, to explain to 10,000 men that they were about to become prisoners of war, that they would spend the rest of the war in German prison camps, that they would lose months or years of their lives, that they would face hunger, cold, disease, possible death from bombing or disease or execution if Germany decided to ignore the Geneva Convention. Harrison called his officers together. He explained what he had decided. He explained why. He told them the truth. He was surrendering the regiment to save a civilian child. He knew this was military madness. He knew it violated every doctrine of warfare. He knew it would be seen as cowardice, as betrayal, as criminal dereliction of duty. He knew some of his men would hate him for it. He knew history would judge him harshly. He knew he was trading his career, his freedom, possibly his life, for one French girl's survival. But he was doing it anyway, because the alternative was letting her die, and Harrison couldn't do that. He couldn't look at a 6-year-old child and decide that military strategy mattered more than her life. Some officers supported him immediately. Others argued. Captain Chen maintained this was wrong, was criminal, was a betrayal of every soldier in the regiment. Major Bradley indicated he disagreed with Harrison's decision, but would execute it because Harrison was his commanding officer, and that's how military hierarchy worked. Harrison then spoke to the entire regiment. He gathered as many men as could hear him. He stood on a truck bed so they could see him, and he told them what he was about to do. The reaction was mixed. Some men were relieved. They would survive. They would live through the war. They would eventually go home. Yes, they would be prisoners, but they would be alive. Some men were angry. They had been fighting for days. They had seen friends die. They had held the line. And now they were surrendering, giving up, letting the enemy win. One sergeant, Michael O'Brien, 32 years old from Boston, climbed onto the truck beside Harrison. O'Brien was popular with the men, combat veteran, tough, respected. O'Brien confronted Harrison about surrendering to save one child. Harrison confirmed it. O'Brien called it the stupidest thing he ever heard. But then O'Brien's expression changed. He acknowledged it was also the bravest, and maybe the rightest. He had 2 kids at home. If they were in that house, he would want someone to save them. O'Brien shook Harrison's hand. Other men saw it. Some started clapping. Not all of them. Maybe half. But enough. Enough to show Harrison that at least some of his men understood. Some agreed. Some believed that maybe, just maybe, there were things more important than military victory. At 1:45 p.m., Harrison sent a squad to evacuate Marie and her grandmother. The squad was led by Lieutenant James Parker, 24 years old, volunteer from Michigan. Parker took 8 men. They approached the house with white flags. German forces held their fire. Parker entered the house, found Marie and her grandmother, explained in broken French that they needed to leave. The grandmother didn't want to go. She was terrified of the Germans. She was terrified of the Americans. She just wanted to hide and wait for the war to pass. Parker picked up Marie. He carried her out of the house. His men supported the grandmother. They walked slowly back to American lines with white flags visible. German soldiers watched, but didn't fire. Parker brought Marie and her grandmother to Harrison. Harrison knelt down so he was eye level with Marie. She looked terrified. She was crying. She didn't understand what was happening. Harrison smiled at her. Marie didn't understand English, but she understood the smile. She understood the kindness in Harrison's voice. She stopped crying. She hugged Harrison. She whispered something in French. Harrison's translator conveyed that she was thanking him. She was calling him a good man. Harrison felt tears in his eyes. He had condemned 10,000 men to imprisonment for this moment, for this child's life, for this hug. He didn't know if it was worth it. He didn't know if he had made the right choice. He only knew he couldn't have made any other choice. At 2 p.m., Colonel Harrison ordered his regiment to lay down their weapons. White flags were raised. German forces moved in to take custody of the Americans. The process took 3 hours. 10,000 men filed into prisoner columns. They were searched, documented, and marched away toward German prisoner camps. Harrison was the last American to surrender. He stood on the bridge where he had made his decision. He watched his men leave. Some looked at him with respect. Some looked at him with anger. Some just looked exhausted, ready for the war to be over, even if it meant imprisonment. Colonel Richter approached Harrison personally. Richter spoke English. He confessed he had never seen anything like this. Harrison had surrendered an entire regiment for one child. Harrison confirmed it. Richter observed that this was either great courage or great foolishness. Harrison suggested it was probably both. Richter assured Harrison his men would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He gave his word. Harrison thanked him. Richter asked what Harrison thought would happen to him after the war. Harrison predicted court-martial, prison, possibly execution. Richter noted that Harrison had done this anyway. Harrison confirmed. Richter was quiet for a moment. Then he expressed hope that Harrison's country would understand what he did, that they would see the courage in it. Harrison responded that they wouldn't. They would see cowardice, betrayal, failure. Richter nodded. He observed that for what it was worth, he saw a man who valued human life above military victory. In a war where millions die, that was a rare thing. Harrison was taken into custody. He was separated from his men. As a colonel, as the officer who had surrendered, he was treated differently. He was interrogated. German intelligence wanted to understand why he had surrendered. Was it a trick? Was there some American plan they didn't understand? Was Harrison a traitor who had betrayed his country for some promise of reward? Harrison told them the truth. He surrendered to save a child. That was the entire explanation. The German interrogators didn't believe him at first. It was too simple, too irrational. No military officer would surrender 10,000 men for one civilian. There had to be another reason. But there wasn't. Harrison repeated his story. Eventually, they believed him, because there was no other explanation that made sense. News of Harrison's surrender reached American forces within hours. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Colonel Mitchell, Harrison's division commander, was furious. He reported Harrison for dereliction of duty, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and unauthorized surrender of forces. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was informed within 24 hours. Eisenhower's reaction was cold. A colonel does not have authority to surrender his regiment without orders. Harrison's actions were criminal. When he was recovered, he would face full court-martial. The story spread through the American military. Most reactions were negative. Officers were horrified. Harrison had violated the most fundamental principle of military command. You don't surrender. You fight until ordered to withdraw or until you are physically unable to continue. Surrender without orders is cowardice. It's betrayal. But some soldiers, particularly enlisted men, had a different reaction. They understood what Harrison had done. He had saved lives. Yes, those lives would spend time in prisoner camps, but they would survive. They would eventually go home. Harrison had chosen life over glory, survival over tactics. Some soldiers saw courage in that. Others saw wisdom. The public reaction was even more divided. When news of Harrison's surrender reached America, the initial newspaper reports were negative. The New York Times headline read, "Colonel surrenders entire regiment." The article described Harrison as an officer who had abandoned his duty, betrayed his men, and given the enemy a significant tactical victory. But then more details emerged. Reporters discovered why Harrison had surrendered. The story of Marie Dubois came out, a 6-year-old French girl, an orphan, about to be killed in crossfire, and an American colonel who chose to save her life at the cost of his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. The story caught the public imagination. Editorials were written. Some condemned Harrison as a traitor who had put sentiment above military duty. Others praised him as a hero who had remembered why America was fighting in the first place: to protect the innocent, to stand against evil, to value human life. Religious leaders particularly supported Harrison. Ministers and priests and rabbis preached sermons about his decision. They argued he had shown true moral courage, that he had valued a child's life above worldly considerations of career and reputation. that he had acted according to the highest principles of human decency. Harrison's wife, Elizabeth, was interviewed by newspapers. She expressed pride in her husband. She maintained he had done the right thing. She noted that if their daughter Sarah had been in that house, she would want someone to make the same choice Harrison made. But the military's position never changed. Harrison had disobeyed orders. He had surrendered forces without authorization. These were crimes. He would face trial. Harrison spent 9 months in a German prisoner of war camp. He was held with other captured Allied officers. Life in the camp was difficult, but not brutal. Germany still respected the Geneva Convention at this point in the war, especially for American and British prisoners. Harrison received Red Cross parcels. He could write letters home, though they were censored. He waited for the war to end. In the prisoner camp, Harrison was treated as a curiosity by other captured officers. Some avoided him. He was a coward in their eyes, a disgrace to the uniform. Others sought him out. They wanted to understand his thinking. Why had he done it? How did he live with the decision? Harrison explained his reasoning over and over. Each time, he came back to the same point. Marie was a child. Her life mattered. If winning the war meant letting children die when you could save them, then what were you really winning? Some officers understood. Others didn't. But Harrison noticed something interesting. The longer officers spent in the prisoner camp, the more they understood his choice. When you're sitting in a prison camp with nothing to do but think, when you've seen men die and experienced the full horror of war, when you've had time to question why any of this matters, the idea of choosing to save a child starts to make more sense. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, exactly 1 year after Harrison's surrender. Allied forces liberated the prisoner camps. Harrison was freed along with thousands of other captured soldiers. He was immediately taken into U.S. military custody. His court-martial began on July 15, 1945. The charges were dereliction of duty in the face of the enemy, cowardice before the enemy, unauthorized surrender of forces, and disobeying direct orders from a superior officer. Any one of these charges could result in execution. Together, they made Harrison's conviction almost certain. The prosecution argued that Harrison had betrayed fundamental military principles, that his actions had given the enemy a significant tactical victory, that he had cost the Allied advance valuable time, that he had endangered other American units by surrendering his regiment. Harrison's defense attorney, a military lawyer named Captain Richard Walsh, argued that Harrison had faced an impossible moral choice, that he had chosen to save an innocent life, that this showed not cowardice, but extraordinary moral courage, that Harrison had understood that American values meant protecting the innocent, and he had acted on that understanding even at tremendous personal cost. The prosecution brought forward military experts who explained why Harrison's decision was wrong from every tactical and strategic perspective. They showed how his surrender had delayed the Allied advance. They calculated how many additional casualties other units had suffered because Harrison's regiment was not holding its position. The defense brought forward testimony from Harrison's men. Sergeant O'Brien testified that Harrison's decision had saved their lives, that they would have been slaughtered if they had continued fighting, that Harrison had chosen their survival over his career. Other soldiers testified similarly. The defense also brought Marie Dubois to testify. She was 7 years old now. 1 year had passed. She stood in the courtroom, small and frightened, and through a translator she answered questions. Yes, she had been in the house. Yes, she had been frightened. Yes, the American officer had saved her life. The prosecutor asked her if she understood that 10,000 American soldiers had become prisoners to save her. She indicated no, she didn't understand that. She was 7. She just knew that the kind officer had saved her and her grandmother. The prosecutor asked if she thought her life was worth 10,000 soldiers becoming prisoners. Marie looked confused. Her translator explained the question. Marie thought about it. Then she responded through the translator that she didn't know about soldiers. She just knew she didn't want to die. It was a child's answer. Simple, honest, heartbreaking. Harrison testified on his own behalf. He explained his decision. He didn't claim he was right. He didn't claim he had followed military doctrine. He simply explained that he had been faced with a choice: let a child die or save her at tremendous cost. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't make the calculation that her life mattered less than tactical advantage. He had chosen to save her. He would make the same choice again. The prosecution asked Harrison if he understood that he had violated orders. Harrison confirmed yes. Did he understand that he had endangered other American forces? Harrison confirmed yes. Did he understand that military discipline required following orders even when you disagreed with them? Harrison confirmed yes. Then why had he disobeyed? Harrison responded that he had looked at a 6-year-old child and couldn't let her die when he could save her, even if saving her meant losing everything, even if it meant he would be standing there on trial for his life. Because if he couldn't make that choice, then he didn't deserve to wear the uniform. The court-martial took 2 weeks. The verdict came on July 29, 1945. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was dishonorable discharge, 20 years imprisonment, and forfeiture of all pay and benefits. The court specifically noted that they had considered the death penalty, but decided against it because Harrison's actions, while criminal from a military standpoint, had been motivated by an attempt to save civilian life, rather than by cowardice or treason. Harrison was sent to Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas. He would serve his sentence there. His wife Elizabeth divorced him 6 months later. She still loved him, she explained. She understood why he had done what he did. But she couldn't handle the shame, the stigma, the knowledge that her husband was in prison convicted of cowardice. She took their daughter Sarah and moved to California. Harrison never saw them again. Harrison served 6 years of his sentence. He was a model prisoner. He worked in the prison library. He read constantly. He wrote letters to military ethicists, philosophers, religious leaders, anyone who might engage with the questions his case raised. Is there ever a time when saving one innocent life justifies military defeat? Can a soldier choose mercy over orders? Where is the line between courage and cowardice? In 1951, Harrison's case came to the attention of President Harry Truman. Truman had his own complicated relationship with impossible moral decisions. He had ordered the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He had made the calculation that killing hundreds of thousands of civilians was justified if it ended the war and saved American soldiers' lives. Truman read the Harrison court-martial transcripts. He read Harrison's letters from prison. And Truman made a decision. On December 15, 1951, Truman commuted Harrison's sentence to time served. Harrison was released from prison. The commutation included a statement from Truman that acknowledged Colonel Harrison had faced an impossible choice and made a decision that violated military law, but upheld a higher moral law. While Truman could not excuse the disobedience of orders, he could recognize the extraordinary moral courage required to sacrifice everything for the life of one innocent child. Harrison was 48 years old when he was released. He had no career, no family, no money. His dishonorable discharge stood. He would receive no military pension. He was a convicted coward in the eyes of the U.S. military. But he was free. Harrison moved to Vermont. He got a job as a clerk in a hardware store. He lived in a small apartment. He kept to himself. He rarely talked about the war or his trial or his decision. When people asked what he had done during the war, he simply said he had been a soldier. He didn't elaborate. In 1955, Harrison received a letter from France, from Marie Dubois. She was 17 years old now. She had learned English. She had learned about what Harrison had done to save her. She had learned that he had spent years in prison. She wanted to thank him. She wanted him to know that she had survived, that she was alive because of him, that she would never forget his kindness. Harrison wrote back. They became pen pals. Marie wrote to him about her life in France, about finishing school, about her grandmother who had died in 1953, about her plans to become a teacher. Harrison wrote about Vermont, about the changing seasons, about the books he was reading. In 1963, Marie came to America. She was 25 years old. She had graduated from university. She had saved money to travel. She wanted to meet Harrison in person, to thank him face-to-face for saving her life 19 years earlier. They met in a cafe in Burlington, Vermont. Harrison was 60 years old, graying, quiet, still carrying the weight of his decision. Marie was young, energetic, alive. She hugged him. She cried. She told him in English that he had saved her, that he had given up everything to save her. Harrison replied he would do it again. Marie insisted he was a hero. Harrison shook his head. He wasn't a hero, he maintained. Heroes were brave. He was just someone who couldn't let a child die. Marie countered that this was brave, the bravest thing she had ever heard of. They spent 3 days together. Marie told Harrison about her life, about teaching elementary school in Paris, about her students, about how she tried every day to be worthy of the sacrifice Harrison had made for her. Harrison told her she didn't need to be worthy. Her life had value simply because she was alive. That was the whole point. Every human life had infinite value. That's what he had believed then. That's what he still believed now. When Marie left to return to France, she gave Harrison a photograph. It was a picture of her with her first class of students. 23 children, ages 6 to 8. She explained that because of him, she was alive to teach these children. Because of him, she could help them. Everything good she did in her life existed because he had chosen to save her. Harrison kept that photograph on his wall for the rest of his life. The years passed. Harrison grew older. He never remarried. He never reconciled with his daughter Sarah. He continued working at the hardware store until he retired at age 70. He lived simply, quietly, without recognition or honor. But opinions about his case were changing. In the 1960s and 1970s, as America fought in Vietnam and struggled with questions about military morality, Harrison's story was re-examined. Ethicists and military historians began writing about his case. Was he a coward or a hero? Had he failed his duty or transcended it? In 1978, a historian named Dr. Robert Chang published a book about Harrison's case titled The Courage to Save: One Man's Choice Between Orders and Conscience. The book argued that Harrison had made the most moral choice possible in an impossible situation, that he had understood something fundamental about military victory meaning nothing if it requires abandoning your moral core. The book sold well. It sparked renewed debate. Some still argued Harrison was a coward who had betrayed his men. Others argued he was a hero who had prioritized human life over military objectives. In 1982, the U.S. Army conducted a formal review of Harrison's court-martial. The review board concluded that while Harrison had violated military law, His actions reflected extraordinary moral conviction and a profound commitment to the protection of innocent life. The review board recommended changing Harrison's dishonorable discharge to a general discharge under honorable conditions. They recommended restoring his rank. They recommended issuing a formal acknowledgement that his actions, while militarily incorrect, had been morally defensible. The recommendation was sent to the Secretary of Defense. It was approved. On November 11, 1982, Veterans Day, the Army issued a statement. Harrison's discharge was upgraded, his rank was restored. He would receive military benefits going forward. The statement acknowledged that Colonel James Harrison had faced an impossible choice and chosen to save an innocent life at tremendous personal cost. While his actions violated military protocol, they reflected the highest ideals of human decency and moral courage. The United States Army recognized that Colonel Harrison's decision, though unauthorized, represented a profound commitment to the protection of human life. Harrison was 79 years old when he received the news. He was interviewed by newspapers. They asked how he felt about the Army's decision. He expressed gratitude. He maintained he had never regretted his choice. He noted that, if he had it to do over again, he would make the same decision. Reporters asked if he thought he was a hero. Harrison replied, "No. Heroes did extraordinary things. He had just done the only thing he could live with. He had chosen to save a child. That wasn't heroic. That was just human." But what about the 10,000 men who became prisoners? What about the tactical defeat? What about violating orders? Harrison acknowledged he thought about those things every day. He thought about every man who spent years in a prison camp because of his decision. Some of those men probably died in those camps. Some probably never recovered from the experience. He carried that responsibility. But he also knew that if he had followed orders, Marie would have died. And he couldn't live with that. He could live with being called a coward. He could live with prison. He could live with losing his career and his family. But he couldn't live with letting a child die when he could save her. In 1985, Marie came to America again. She was 47 years old. She had married. She had children of her own. She brought her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 10, to meet Harrison. She wanted them to meet the man who had saved her life, the man who had made it possible for them to exist. Harrison met Marie's daughters. They looked like Marie had looked 41 years earlier, innocent, alive, full of possibility. And Harrison realized that by saving Marie, he hadn't just saved one life. He had saved all the lives that would come from her, her children, eventually her grandchildren, every descendant she would ever have existed, because Harrison had made one choice on one day in 1944. Marie observed that by saving her, Harrison had saved all of them. Everyone who came from her owed their existence to him. Harrison cried. He was 82 years old, and he cried because he finally understood the full weight of what he had done. Not just saving one child, but saving everyone who would come from that child. Generations of human beings who would exist because he had chosen mercy over tactics. James William Harrison died on March 17, 1989. He was 86 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep in his small apartment in Vermont. He was buried with military honors, colonel rank, American flag on his coffin, honor guard. Marie Dubois attended his funeral. So did 14 of Harrison's former soldiers. Men who had spent years in German prisoner camps because of his decision. They came to honor him. They came to say that they understood, that they had come to believe he had made the right choice, that saving a child mattered more than military victory. One of those soldiers, retired Sergeant Michael O'Brien, age 77, spoke at the funeral. He recalled that Colonel Harrison had given the order that sent them to prison camps for years. Some people called that cowardice. He called it courage, because Harrison knew what it would cost him. He knew he would lose everything. And he did it anyway, because he couldn't let a child die. That wasn't cowardice. That was the bravest thing O'Brien ever saw. And he was proud to have served under Harrison. Marie spoke as well. She noted that she was alive because of James Harrison. Her children were alive because of him. Her grandchildren would be alive because of him. He had given up everything so that she could live. He sacrificed his career, his freedom, his family, his reputation. He did this for a 6-year-old French girl he didn't know. He did it because he believed that every human life has infinite value. He was right, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of his sacrifice. After Harrison's death, his story continued to be debated. Military academies used his case as a teaching tool. What would you do in Harrison's situation? Where is the line between following orders and following conscience? Is there ever a time when saving one life justifies military defeat? There are no easy answers. Different people reach different conclusions. But Harrison's case forces the question of what we're fighting for. If we're fighting to protect the innocent, then what does it mean to let innocents die, because protecting them is militarily inconvenient? In 2019, the U.S. Army unveiled a memorial to James Harrison at Fort Leavenworth, the same prison where he had been incarcerated. The memorial is a statue showing Harrison kneeling beside a small child. The inscription reads, Colonel James William Harrison, 1902-1989. He chose mercy over orders. He chose life over victory. He chose conscience over career. He chose to save one child, and in doing so, he showed us what we're fighting for. Marie Dubois Laurent, having married and taken her husband's name, attended the dedication ceremony. She was 81 years old. She brought her children, her grandchildren, and her 2 great-grandchildren. 4 generations of human beings who existed because of Harrison's choice. Marie spoke at the ceremony. James Harrison had saved her life in 1944, she noted. But he did more than that. He showed the world that every human life is precious, that a child's life is worth more than tactical advantage, that being a good person sometimes means disobeying orders and accepting the consequences. He was punished for his choice. He spent years in prison. He lost his family. He lost his career. But he never regretted it. And neither did she. Because she was alive. Because her children were alive. Because 4 generations of her family existed. Because one man chose to save her. James Harrison was a hero, she maintained. Not because he won battles, but because he understood what was worth fighting for. And he never forgot it. Not even when it cost him everything. The story of James Harrison and Marie Dubois raises profound questions about military duty, moral responsibility, and the value of human life. Was Harrison right to surrender 10,000 men to save one child? From a purely military standpoint, no. His decision was indefensible. It violated every principle of military command. It cost the Allies tactical advantage. It endangered other units. It was, by any military standard, a disaster. But from a moral standpoint, that's a different question. Harrison looked at a 6-year-old child and couldn't let her die when he had the power to save her. He understood that military victory means nothing if it requires abandoning your humanity. He chose to value one human life above strategic objectives, and he paid the price for that choice. Was it worth it? Ask Marie. Ask her children. Ask her grandchildren. Ask her great-grandchildren. For them, the answer is clear. Their entire existence depends on Harrison's choice. Without him, they would never have been born. But ask Harrison's men who spent years in prison camps. Ask the other American units who had to fight harder because Harrison's regiment surrendered. Ask Harrison's wife and daughter who lost husband and father. For them, the answer might be different. There is no objectively correct answer. Harrison's case sits at the intersection of military necessity and human morality. It forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions about what we value and why. But perhaps the most important thing about Harrison's story is not whether he was right or wrong. Perhaps what matters is that he faced an impossible choice and made a decision he could live with. He chose to save a child. He accepted all consequences of that choice. And he never claimed to be a hero. He simply maintained he couldn't let a child die. In the end, maybe that's what courage actually means. Not fearlessness in battle, not following orders without question, but making the choice that lets you live with yourself, even if that choice costs everything. James Harrison made that choice on May 8, 1944. He gave up his career, his freedom, his family, his reputation. He surrendered 10,000 men. He violated military law. He disobeyed direct orders. He accepted court-martial, imprisonment, and disgrace. And he saved Marie Dubois. 75 years later, 4 generations of her family exist because of his choice. They live, love, work, raise children, contribute to the world. All because one man decided that a child's life mattered more than military victory. Was he right? History will debate that question forever. But one thing is certain. James Harrison believed every human life has infinite value, and he lived according to that belief, even when it cost him everything. That belief, that commitment, that willingness to sacrifice everything for an innocent life, that is what made James Harrison extraordinary. Not his military record, not his tactical decisions, but his moral core, his refusal to compromise on what he believed was right, his choice to save one child no matter the cost. And in a world that often values power over compassion, victory over mercy, strategy over humanity, James Harrison's choice stands as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to save one life. Just one. Because every life matters. Because children deserve protection. Because being human means sometimes sacrificing the practical for the moral. James Harrison surrendered 10,000 men to save one child. Some call it cowardice. Some call it foolishness. Some call it the greatest act of moral courage in military history. Whatever you call it, it happened. And Marie Dubois lived. And that, perhaps, is all that really matters.